You and I all grew up hearing about the dyad, the mythic dyad, of course the fight between good and evil, and of course the Tao, the yin and the yang. Please don't ask me about Taoism, by the way. Yin and yang, you know, the inseparable binary. The inseparable binary, by the way, the Greeks referred to, and they're untranslatable. The primary word is ananke, which is unfortunately translated as necessity, or the aoristos dias, which is incorrectly also translated as the indefinite dyad. I wrote an article about the indefinite dyad, the world's only accurate indefinite article on the indefinite dyad, by the way, correctly explaining it. And of course, it's the principle of the principle. It's the premise of the principle and the attribute. Hello, I'm going to spit it out there eventually. Like light and illumination, the inseparable holos, the whole between principle and attribute, because there's nothing in the universe that doesn't actually have at least one attribute, including the good. You know, the attribute of the good is to do good. Not true action, but the attribute of what it is. It is perfect in what it is and in what it does, but it doesn't do anything. What we say that the good does is, of course, what it actually is. What it is also what it does, but it doesn't mean do in the conventional sense of doing something. But that's, of course, the basis for another video on, you know, the metaphysics of the absolute. The real principle, however, is not the mythic dyad, but it's the metaphysical triad. And of course, Christianity stole this from ancient metaphysics, as well as every other religion. I'm not ragging on Christianity, by the way. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. You know, it's a Trinity. You know, the three are different things. You know, this would be like a Irish priest trying to explain the Trinity, which of course they can't do because they have no idea where the hell it came from or what it really means. You know, they're all together, the Father, the Son, and the Holy. That's where the Trinity came from. Of course, they got that from the Egyptians. The Egyptians from somebody else earlier than them, which we don't have record for in history. But getting on to the main principle, and I've explained this in countless videos, I find it fascinating that everything actually follows everything else, in that on my book on field theory, since there's no distinction between physics and metaphysics, they're just separate sides of the exact same silver of the coinage. When someone said this is the head and this is the tail, if you had wisdom, you would say, no, these are the principle and attribute of the silver. You know? The silver, of course, would be the plane of existence. The triad of true hardcore metaphysics, and is reflected also too in field theory, is the principle and the attribute and the melding of the three insofar as ontos, or life, or the plane of inertia. On our Milky Way galaxy here, all life exists on the plane of inertia. Most life, even though of course people live up in Alaska and some people are down in Antarctica, 95% of life exists on a wide band on this Earth on the plane of inertia, for example. The plane of inertia, which you can see with the magnetic field finder, the green magnetic field finding film, and you could also field finding film, there's 3 F's. You can also see it too, of course, as I've shown you in hundreds of videos on the supercell. This is the triad of the entire universe, the principle and the attribute. And of course, even though I've defined it countless times, you know, the principle is the dielectric. It is non-Cartesian, pure potential in counter space. The movement towards counter space, or we would call the return to the one, yeah, which Joseph Campbell adopted, and which was, of course, taken up by Star Wars, the return to the one. You know, it's the fight between good and evil. If we actually retroduct this back to the geometry of the most simplex field theory, simplex geometry of fields. Magnetism, of course, is the centrifugal divergent torus. Actually, but the two superimposed, of course, are a sphere. This is probably the reason why Nikola Tesla said his favorite, this isn't a perfect sphere, it's kind of a lumpy grapefruit. His reason why Nikola Tesla's ashes are inside of a gold sphere in Serbia, because it's his favorite shape. But the superimposition of the hyperboloid, i.e. the hourglass shape, which is the geometry of increasing inertia and acceleration, the geometry of centripetal convergence, i.e. the geometry towards counter space, and of course there's a centrifugal geometry, the toroidal geometry of centrifugal divergence, i.e. magnetism. And magnetism creates space. Space has no properties. It is literally the after effect of a divergent loss of energy or inertia. Magnetism, as Faraday said, is a dielectric field. So when we say dielectricity and magnetism, it's like saying ice and water. Well, you and I both know that water is just a temperature-pressure modality, specifically temperature modality, of water. They're both one and the same thing. Human beings love to classify things, even if they're basically the same thing. Magnetism and dielectricity are absolutely the same thing, but the loss of that energy or inertia breeds these increasing centrifugal, and all force vectors are three-dimensional S-curves. The three-dimensional S-curve are the extrapolation of the interior geometry of a torus or a donut shape. Yeah? These create the expanding, contracting loops of magnetism. The after effect of a three-dimensional S-curve is space itself. But space has, as Nikola Tesla famously said, no properties. And this, of course, would be evil. Not that magnetism is evil in itself. The after effect of what magnetism leaves behind, i.e. space, is evil. Space is magnitude and mass and volume. Everything that, and mass, of course, creates shadows, i.e. the privation of light. So the premise, the root, the ultimate root of evil is magnetism. In other words, to go forth, i.e. to leave the one, the creation of space, i.e. the centrifugal force and motion, divergent three-dimensional force vector divergence from the plane of, from counter space, from inertia, is magnetism. However, life, and also too, all of these field geometries follow perfectly the right-hand rule. If you don't know what the right-hand rule is, you need to Google search it. There are a million different pictures and a million different examples. I don't need to explain it since everybody else out there explains it perfectly. However, they never explain why it's that way. It's called the right-hand rule. The plane of inertia sits at 45 degrees to the 45-degree force vector of magnetic centrifugal divergence, and magnetic centrifugal divergence sits at 45 degrees to the increasing inertia and acceleration force vector of the plane of counter space. Plane of inertia sits 90 degrees relative to the hyperboloid of counter space, and it sits 45 degrees to the centrifugal force vector of magnetism. I should whip out a Sharpie marker on this, but I think you got the message without me drawing on this grapefruit with a Sharpie marker. You may not think this is stunning, but if you actually take, a moment while you're soaking in the tub or whatever to think about it, absolutely everything in nature and the entire cosmos is mirrored by this. Evil is the after effect of a centrifugal magnetic force vector. Good and evil. The good, of course, is the one. We all know this. The good is the return to counter space. Everything that is mass and magnitude and partakes of change and time. Time doesn't exist. It exists conventionally, but not ultimately. Time is the measure, and time is only a measure of mass and magnitude and the movement of them and the interplay between them, but it doesn't exist. Time is not a thing. Space is not a thing either. Space is just the after effect of a divergent centrifugal force vector, i.e. magnetism. Magnetism is not different than dielectricity. It only has a completely different property because the loss of energy or inertia breeds the three-dimensional force vector, which is expansive. That loss of energy or inertia must manifest something, and that manifestation is centrifugal divergence, and the after effect that comes with that, because when there is this, there is that. When there is not this, then there is not that. That's an ancient Indian and Greek paradigm, by the way. When this is present, that is present. When this is not present, then that is not present. This is found over and over again in ancient Pali within the Nikayas, Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, and Guttara Nikaya, Kudaka Nikaya, which I translate, by the way, in ancient dead language. But this is the triad. Life, of course, is the plane of inertia. 95% of life, not just on this world, 95% of life exists only on the plane of inertia because it is the maximum field vector against both the dielectric and the magnetic. It is the hybrid of both, the magnetic and the dielectric. But the only pressure point in which it thrives, and mostly lives, 95% plus of life in the universe, only exists on the plane of inertia. That means that life is the plane of inertia. It's the melding of the magnetic and the dielectric. And of course, all life is a composite. It is the fifth of the Fibonacci sequence, which is monad, mind, magnitude, matter, and man. By man, I mean living beings. It doesn't have to be man exactly, specifically, just they all start with an M. These, of course, are the principle, monad, and the aoristostaias. Over here we actually have mass and magnitude, and over here we actually have life, which is the combination of both of these. This is the triad of everything, good and evil. Evil is not like the flip side of good. But good can't exist without evil, and evil can't. That's not true at all. We've all heard that crap. Evil is just the after effect of a divergent field, which of course sets up mass and magnitude, and that sets up the absence of the good, or light, like a shadow is cast in the after effect of an object, the shadow side. And then we have all the antinomies that make up human suffering. Everything in the universe follows this. We have the dielectric and the magnetic, which are both one. Just like ice and water are not two different things. Well, that's ice and that's water. No, they're both water, you idiot. Magnetism is the dielectric field. We give it a different name because it acts and behaves completely different. I've explained why it acts and behaves in completely different. The loss of energy or inertia must manifest or do something. What happens is resultant to, or the premise for, the loss of energy or inertia. And by the way, the why is anything present at all, and that, of course, formula is tattooed right here on the inside of my right wrist, which is my discovery, right? 1 over 5 to the power of -3. That would take hours and hours to explain. So this is the mythic dyad, and also, too, the triad. The principle, the hyperboloid, and by the way, the negative image of a torus is a hyperboloid, and the negative image of a hyperboloid is a torus. But the superimposition of the hyperboloid and the torus is this, a sphere. Because we all know a donut has this empty spot in the center, and it's missing the upper portion up here. The superimposition of the hyperboloid and the torus is this. And the max throw against the dielectric and the magnetic is the plane of inertia, which is where life is present. Everything in the universe follows this without fail. The entire universe.